There's so much analytical value we can get out of humor and comedy. Due to its non-serious nature, we tend to not take humor seriously for the social functions that it plays in our everyday lives. Some people looking at humor on that surface level may not realize how humor is socially significant and it's worthy of academic study. Just like gossip, just like medical discourse, just like academic discourse. As with all those topics, we tend to take them for granted, and it's not until this course that we can point out the significant forms of communication and power relations and social relations that are at play in all these things. So with humor and comedy, a lot of the most salient social commentary and social criticism and advocacy for social change is conveyed through comedic communication. And it's because socially charged communication takes a humorous form that it is so effectively received by audiences of potentially millions. Comedy is a very effective vehicle for transmitting meaning, and thus it's very often used for communicating meanings related to our social relations and our the structures of our societies, and pointing out things we otherwise may not have seen if they weren't communicated to us in this humorous form. You know, I never found out what the word apocalypse means. Oh well, it's not the end of the world. So humor is ubiquitous in everyday life. We laugh multiple times a day, hopefully. But still, despite us encountering humor very often in our everyday lives, the phenomenon is still relatively unexplored and unphilosophized. Like I said, it's very often just taken for granted as just a part of life without deconstructing its socially constructed nature or analyzing the functions, the roles that humor serves in everyday life. There's no objective checklist or requirement for something to be considered funny. Humor is very much a subjective experience that varies from person to person. You can't simply pin down a list of necessary or sufficient conditions for humor. You can't say, oh, I got this part, I got that part, I got that part, therefore this must be funny because I checked off all the list. There's no such thing as something objectively funny, universally funny. It may be funny for some people or in some contexts, but there'll always be that contextual contingency in order for a joke to land or someone to laugh or to find something funny or for something to be considered comedic. It'll depend on the role of the receiver, the subjectivity of the person receiving that comedic communication and interpreting it as funny. And is humor strictly a human phenomenon? Is it exclusive to humans, or can other animals appreciate humor? Animals can communicate and interpret meaning. We've known that ever since the week on semiotics. Even if it's not strictly a language, they're communicating with their body language to be able to send and receive messages of danger or harm or mating or alert other animals to food sources. So they can share meaning with each other, but can they share humorous meaning? Can they understand if a situation is humorous? Like if a gorilla sees another gorilla trip and fall, as long as they know the gorilla is okay, can they appreciate the humor in that situation? Or do they just interpret what they see in a more straightforward fashion without those additional humorous connotations and humorous meanings that could be derived if humans were to experience that? So another example, dogs play with each other. As puppies, they pretend fight by chasing each other and play biting, but not actually biting and attacking each other. So they have a sense of playing around. They have a sense of imagination. They can imagine that they're actually fighting while just play fighting. So does this capacity for imagination and playfulness indicate possession of some sort of sense of humor? Like you can tickle a dog and they'll react playfully and they'll start panting and lolling their tongue and wagging their tail. Is that their version of laughing? Because we can't expect other animals' forms of laughter to take the exact form that our laughter takes, but maybe that's their version of laughing. Does humor require a spoken language, a shared system of linguistic signs and meanings that animals don't possess? I think we can all think of an example where we found something funny without necessarily any language being exchanged. So it's arguably a human phenomenon, but It's certainly a shared social phenomenon. Humor doesn't just spring from within us in a vacuum. It requires some sort of interaction between people or interaction with the sensory world around us for us to react to something humorously. Like if you were born and raised in a pitch black basement, never being let out, never interacting with anyone else, just living in darkness, you wouldn't even know what the term humor means, let alone have a sense of humor and be able to joke around because there's nothing to bounce your joke off of. Jokes are usually observational. You're observing something in the world around you. So you need some sort of sensory stimulus or some sort of interactivity, some sort of social element within which humor can be shared and flourish. This is why it's so much easier to laugh when we're in the company of others. We're so much more liable to start laughing or find something humorous than if we're just alone. Something that might make me just smile if I see it when I'm by myself might make me belly laugh if I'm with others who start laughing, because they kind of serve as social reference points saying, this is funny, we should be laughing. So it takes two, at least, to have humor and to convey humor. And there are different processes involved in producing humor and consuming it. A lot more active effort and strategy goes into making something humorous. You have to know your audience, you have to research your audience and cater your humor to them. But on the flip side, in order to consume that piece of humor, you just need to pay attention. It's just kind of a passive recipient of the humor that's actively constructed. But like I said, there's often a give and take. There's often a dialectical dynamic to the production and consumption of humor, so that the recipient may not be passive, they may be active in negotiating and constructing and reconstructing the meaning of something humorous. So a recipient, upon hearing a joke, could tag the joke with a punchline of their own and begin some sort of humorous back and forth dialogue. An example of that is the comment sections of YouTube videos or other social media platforms, which can often be several times funnier than the videos themselves. Every time I watch a funny video, I have to scroll down to the comments because I know there's going to be a few good top comments there that contribute to the original video and go beyond it in ways that the producer of that original funny video may have never anticipated. As I mentioned at the outset, humor remains relatively neglected by academic consideration, as it's often regarded as a trivial matter that doesn't merit serious consideration or academic study. Therefore, it remains unphilosophized. Remember last week when I was talking about gossip being demonized as the evil tongue and all these negative connotations that make it seem like it's a trivial, petty thing that's unworthy of anyone engaging in. And why is that? Why had work discourse demonized gossip in that way? Because gossip is potentially destabilizing. It's threatening to the social order as it currently stands. So the powers that be don't want people gossiping because it could undermine and challenge the existing state of affairs. And it's the exact same thing with humor. Humor has that potential. It has revolutionary potential to overthrow the current social structures. And the powers that be know that humor has this social power, this social potential. And thus they construct a discourse that makes it seem trivial and petty, and that's something that people should engage in because it's not serious. So that humor isn't just demonized, it's infantilized. It's made to seem childish and immature, and that's something only infants participate in. These are all in attempts to rob humor of its serious power and its serious capacity for social change. Remember what we always say about discourse. Discourse allows certain ways of talking about things, and it also excludes other ways. So academic discourse allows all of the authorized, serious ways of talking about things, and it excludes and disallows and deauthorizes humor as a equally viable way of communicating with just as much significance as any other topic that's discussed and covered in academia, any other discipline and feel, like literature and film and other media that seem to be taken more seriously. So that there are literature departments and film studies departments, but not as many or hardly any, if any, humor studies departments in universities. So just as we discussed with fashion theories, how each one is a different, unique lens with which to view the social phenomenon and the communicative phenomenon of fashion, so that depending on which discipline from which you approach the topic of fashion, you will get a different view of it. Each theoretical lens contributes a different perspective to view fashion that emphasizes some elements and de-emphasizes other elements, depending on what's considered important to look at from within each one of those different lenses of fashion theory. Well, the exact same thing applies to the social and communicative phenomenon of humor. And the academic viewpoint from which humor is studied will determine how humor is conceptualized and thus understood. So that communications department sees humor as communicative, and psychology sees humor as cognitive, and sociology sees humor as social, etc. So communications can be interested in humor because, as I mentioned, humor is pervasive in communication and in social interactions. Humor is a strategy of communication, and humor possesses its own meanings that are expressed and received and interpreted by others in social interactions. And as we talked about last week on work and the week on conversation, communication and relationships are inextricable, and humor as communication can help build relationships. Some of my closest friendships and strongest social bonds are with people with whom I share a similar sense of humor with, so that relationships can be predicated and based on humorous communication and strengthened through that communication. So it's not just a way that participants in a culture can identify themselves as members of said culture and possess and exchange meaning within that context. It can also be used as an exclusionary mechanism to exclude people from a culture if they're the ones being laughed at. So the difference between laughing with someone and laughing at someone. So that humor can also alternatively fulfill the social and communicative function of alienating individuals or groups. And psychologists also study humor, looking at the motivations behind it, the psychological reasons for engaging in humor and appreciating humor. Psychologists will also look at childhood development and the role that humor plays at that formative stage in our lives where we're learning how to function in society and how to live with ourselves. So sometimes kids say the darndest things, or sometimes they make mistakes. And one way of gently correcting their behavior early on in life is for adults or parents to kind of laugh. And that can kind of stick with kids as they grow into adulthood. They remember those cringeworthy memories of them saying something embarrassing as a young child and just all the adults in the room laughing. It serves as a strong reminder not to do that again or to say that again. So that humor plays a fundamental role in our psychological development and psychological maintenance. And sociologists could look at the social functions of humor. As I already mentioned, how participants in a culture can identify with each other and or differentiate from others. So it's a way of relating to others within our social groups, but also distancing ourselves from others, from other social groups. So basically, like in every country, there's a region that's often made fun of by the rest of the country. So in Canada, that's often Newfoundland. There are often all sorts of Newfie jokes. It's an entire genre in its own right. Or in the United States, it's often Southerners who are the butt of jokes. So that people outside of the South or outside of Newfoundland can share these jokes with each other as a way of creating group cohesiveness, saying, you and I are in solidarity because we're not a Newfie or a Southerner. And then there are also modes of, like I said, exclusion going on here and differentiation in expressing differences between social groups. Oftentimes these differences are remarked upon in a humorous way. Otherwise, if it were to take a more serious form, it could result in xenophobia or hatred or violence between groups. Humor also plays a sociological role of establishing norms in society, like what is and isn't okay to joke about and thus talk about. Some cultures and contexts will have more room for maneuverability in terms of what can be discussed and talked about humorously, and then others may be more rigid in their comedic expression, thus setting somewhat of a status quo, a norm that governs not just comedic communication, but communication in general. There's also cultural studies, which can look at the traditions and the shared meanings surrounding the usage of humor in a cultural setting. A lot of academic fields tend to instrumentalize humor and only look at its functions and its uses. Remember, we were talking about the instrumentalization of education, how we only look at education as a stepping stone from point A to point B. Like, what function does this serve for me? A lot of academics reduce humor to that kind of instrumentalist notion of just purely something that can be used, that serves a function, rather than considering its value in its dysfunction, how humor is inherently dysfunctional. Humor is entropic. It could be used to maintain social bonds, but can also be used to dissolve them. Humor is the embrace of all that is random and disorderly and uncertain in our lives and social structures. And this isn't a bad thing that humor tends to defy its own uses. That's useful in itself in its own way. So comedic communication is different from any other form of serious communication, and it shouldn't be bundled into those other forms, because you're missing the key element of humor, is that it is irreverent. It doesn't necessarily have or need to have respect for existing social structures. Humor doesn't have to uphold anything or uphold any meaning. It could disintegrate existing meaning and lead to new meanings.